Veteran Ethan Vance returned home only to bury the past, but his loyal military working dog Max had other plans. Ignoring all commands, Max led him to the forgotten basement and began to scratch desperately at a blank wall. The dog's strange behavior forced Ethan to pay attention. He knocked on the wall, and an unusual hollow sound echoed back. He realized a secret his distant father had hidden for years was right beneath his feet. The decision to break down that wall would reveal a silent sacrifice, changing everything he had ever believed about his father. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The phone rang with the kind of shrill, insistent pierce that felt out of place in the quiet stillness of Ethan's small apartment. He had been cleaning his rifle on the worn kitchen table, a ritual of meticulous care that had followed him from the army into the disorienting calm of civilian life. The scent of gun oil was familiar, grounding. The phone was not. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice a low, neutral baritone. "Vance? Ethan? It's Ben Holloway." The voice on the other end was rough, weathered by sea salt and 60-plus years of Maine winters. It was a voice Ethan had not heard in over a decade, but one he recognized instantly. Mr. Ben, a fixture of his childhood, a man with hands as gnarled as driftwood, who owned the town's hardware store. "Mr. Holloway," Ethan said, his posture straightening instinctively. "It's been a long time." There was a heavy sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire Atlantic Ocean. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, son. It's your father, Samuel. He passed this morning. His heart, the doctor said. It was peaceful." Ethan stood perfectly still. The news did not hit him like a wave, but like a sudden, deadening silence, the kind that follows a distant explosion. He felt nothing, a hollow void where grief was supposed to be. He looked at his hands, steady and clean on the rifle parts. "I see," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "The arrangements are being handled by the municipal office," Ben continued, his voice gentle. "But the house, someone needs to, well, you're his next of kin, Ethan. I figured you should hear it from a friend." "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. I appreciate the call." He was a good man, Ethan. Quiet, but a good man. Ethan did not reply. He ended the call and placed the phone back on its cradle with a quiet click. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a ghost in his own life. Then he moved, not with emotion, but with the chilling efficiency of a soldier given a new, undesirable mission. Pack the truck, secure the gear, final objective, home. His only companion on the long drive north was Max. Max was an 8-year-old German shepherd, a retired military working dog whose sable coat was a distinguished tapestry of gray, silver, and black. His muzzle was frosted with white, but his eyes were a sharp, intelligent amber, missing nothing. He was a silent, stoic professional, much like the man beside him. Max lay on the passenger seat of the pickup truck, his great head resting on his paws, his breathing a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the drone of the highway. He was the only living creature Ethan had allowed himself to get close to in 15 years. The miles dissolved under the truck's tires. Ethan drove with a focused intensity, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if trying to outrun the destination. He had spent 15 years in the United States Army, rising through the ranks, collecting commendations, and building a wall of discipline and distance around the boy he used to be. He had enlisted at 20, not out of a surge of patriotism, but as an act of escape. He was running away from a house on the coast of Maine and from the suffocating silence of the man who lived there. As the landscape shifted from the rolling hills of the South to the dense, dark pine forests of New England, a familiar tightness coiled in his gut. The air grew colder, sharper. He rolled down the window, and the scent of salt and pine hit him, a smell so tied to his past, it felt like a physical blow. He had left this place in the summer of 2010, a boy of 20, with a freshly signed enlistment contract, desperate to prove he was something other than a disappointment. Now, at 35, Ethan Vance was returning. He was a man, lean and hard, with short brown hair and a face that had been weathered by sun and stress, not sea spray. He carried himself with a rigid control, a stillness learned in places where sudden movements could cost you your life. But beneath the soldier's exterior, the 16-year-old boy was stirring, terrified of the ghosts he was about to face. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as the day it happened. It wasn't the event itself, the screech of tires on wet pavement, the sickening crunch of metal, the flashing lights painting the rainy night in strokes of red and blue. It was the aftermath. The long, silent drive home from the sheriff's station with his father. Samuel Vance had not said a single word. He had just driven, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw set like granite. Ethan, shivering and ashamed in the passenger seat, had prayed for his father to yell, to rage, to hit him. Anything would have been better than the terrifying, absolute silence. That silence had become the new language of their home. It filled the hallways, sat between them at the dinner table, and echoed in the spaces where love and forgiveness should have been. Ethan interpreted it as condemnation, a final judgment passed on him. He was a failure, a disgrace. The military, with its clear rules, its loud commands, and its defined purpose, had been his salvation. There was no silence there. He finally turned onto the familiar coastal road. The town was just as he remembered, clinging to the rocky shore like a stubborn barnacle. He drove past the harbor, past Holloway's Hardware, and finally turned onto the gravel lane that led to the house. It stood on a small bluff overlooking the water, a two-story wooden structure that had once been painted a crisp white. Now, the salt and storms had scoured it down to a weary, peeling gray. It looked smaller than he remembered, hunched against the wind, lonely and cold. Max whined softly in the passenger seat, sensing the change in his master. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on Ethan, a silent question in his gaze. "It's all right, boy," Ethan murmured, his voice tight. "Just a place." But it wasn't just a place. It was a tomb of memories he had tried to bury. He parked the truck, the engine's silence replaced by the cry of gulls and the distant crash of waves. He got out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked to the front door. The key was exactly where it always was, under a loose stone by the porch steps. Some things never changed. The door opened with a groan. The air that hit him was stale, cold, and thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and something else, the lingering scent of solitude. He stepped inside, Max close at his heels, and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded final. He stood in the entryway, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. Nothing had been moved. The same worn armchair sat facing the unlit fireplace. The same faded photograph of his mother, who had died when he was 10, sat on the mantelpiece. His father had been a man of routine, of permanence. The house was a museum of his life and of Ethan's failure. He had his mission plan, a 3-day operation. Day 1, initial sweep and assessment. Day 2, clearing and packing any personal effects of value. Day 3, contact a lawyer, sign the paperwork, and list the property for sale. He would liquidate the asset, sever the final connection to this past that had haunted him for nearly 2 decades, and walk away clean. It was a cold, practical strategy, the only way he knew how to survive. He dropped his duffel bag by the door. Max looked up at him, sensing the internal battle. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on the dog's strong neck, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. "Just a few days, Max," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "Then we're gone." But as the profound silence of the house settled around him, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. This wasn't enemy territory he could conquer and abandon. This was home, and its ghosts were already closing in. The first morning in the house was heavy with a cold, damp silence that the pale, watery sunlight could not penetrate. Ethan had woken before dawn, a habit ingrained by 15 years of military routine. He lay on the lumpy guest bed, listening to the house settle around him, each creak and groan a whisper from the past. Beside the bed, Max was already awake, his amber eyes watching his master, his tail giving a single, soft thump against the floorboards. After a breakfast of protein bars and black coffee, Ethan began his mission. Operation Clean Sweep. He would tackle the house room by room, sorting what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. He started with the living room, a space dominated by his father's old armchair and a stone fireplace that had been cold for years. He pulled a white sheet over the chair, a gesture that felt more like shrouding a body than protecting furniture. The work was methodical, physical. He took down the dusty curtains, the fabric crumbling in his hands. He wiped down the mantelpiece, his cloth moving over the faint rectangular outline where his mother's photograph had sat. He had packed it carefully in a box labeled Keep. As he worked, the house began to speak to him, not in words, but in memories, fragmented and persistent. Picking up a pair of his father's worn leather work gloves from a side table, an image surfaced in his mind. He was 9 years old, bursting to tell his father about the model boat he'd finished. Samuel had come home from a long day on the fishing boat, smelling of salt and diesel. He had listened, his face tired and unreadable, and when Ethan finished, he had simply nodded, picked up his newspaper, and the conversation was over. At the time, Ethan had felt a sting of disappointment. He had interpreted the silence not as exhaustion, but as disinterest. He moved on to the bookshelves, a collection of practical manuals on boat engines, carpentry, and weather patterns, with a few worn paperbacks tucked in between. He pulled out a thick volume on diesel engine repair. He remembered being 12, watching his father work on the engine of the Sea Star. Ethan had wanted to help, to learn, but Samuel had communicated only in grunts and gestures, pointing to the wrench he needed, shaking his head at a wrong move. He never explained what he was doing, never invited Ethan into his world of mechanical knowledge. The boy had quickly retreated, feeling clumsy and in the way. He learned then that his father was a man of action, not words. His love, if it existed, was a language Ethan could not understand. Throughout the morning, Max was antsy. The dog, usually a picture of calm discipline, refused to settle. He followed Ethan from one end of the room to the other, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the hardwood floors. He would lie down for a moment, then get up again, pacing a restless circle before letting out a low, almost inaudible whine. "Easy, boy. Settle," Ethan commanded softly. Max would obey for a minute, his ears perked, his gaze sweeping the room. But his anxiety was a low hum that filled the silence, and soon he would be up again, his nose to the floor, sniffing intently along the baseboards as if tracing an invisible scent. By midday, Ethan had cleared most of the living room, sorting items into neat, labeled boxes. He found a small wooden chest tucked away in the back of a closet. He pried open the stiff lid. Inside, nestled among the old documents and receipts, were stacks of photographs held together by brittle rubber bands. He sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, and began to sift through them. Max came over and rested his heavy head on Ethan's knee, sensing a shift in his master's mood. The photos were a chronicle of a life lived in stark, serious tones. There was Samuel as a young man, lean and strong, standing proudly in front of the newly built house, his face unsmiling. There was Samuel with Ethan's mother, a pretty woman with a bright smile. In the photo, his father had an arm around her, but his expression was guarded, his eyes looking somewhere past the camera. Even in moments of apparent joy, he seemed to be holding something back. Then came the photos of Ethan. Ethan as a toddler, taking his first steps on the lawn, with Samuel, a watchful, unsmiling figure in the background. Ethan at 7, holding up his first fish, a proud grin on his face. Samuel stood beside him, holding the rod, his expression stern, as if instructing rather than celebrating. There were pictures of birthdays, of school events, of family trips to the beach. They were all the same. Ethan, a child looking for approval, and Samuel, a father who was present in body, but absent in spirit. A bitter ache spread through Ethan's chest. He sorted through the pile, his fingers moving faster, more desperately. He was looking for one thing, just one picture, a single frame where he and his father were looking at each other, sharing a laugh, a moment of genuine, unguarded connection. A photo that would prove his entire childhood narrative wrong. He found nothing. There were dozens of images, years of his life captured on faded paper, and in every single one, his father's face was a mask of solemn duty. The man in these pictures was a provider, a protector, a teacher, but he was not a friend. He was not a companion. He was a distant, silent authority figure. The ache in Ethan's chest hardened into a cold, familiar certainty. He had not been wrong. He had not misinterpreted his father's silence. It was exactly what it seemed, a vast, empty space where affection was meant to be. He neatly stacked the photos, placed them back in the chest, and closed the lid with a decisive snap. As he stood up, he noticed Max was no longer by his side. The dog was standing at the far end of the entryway, by a narrow door that Ethan knew led to the basement. It was a damp, musty space used for storage, a place his father had rarely gone and had always warned him away from, citing the rickety stairs and the risk of spiders. Max was now completely focused on the door. His body was tense, his ears erect. He was sniffing intently at the crack along the bottom, a low, persistent whine coming from deep in his chest. "Max, leave it," Ethan said, his voice sharp with a sudden, irrational irritation. "There's nothing down there." Max ignored him. He lifted a paw and scratched lightly at the old wood, his whine growing a little louder, more insistent. He looked back at Ethan, his amber eyes filled with a strange urgency, before turning his attention back to the door. A deep, quiet frustration settled over Ethan. He had come home to bury his father, but it felt like the house itself, with its echoing memories and its strange, restless dog, was trying to dig up ghosts he wanted to remain buried forever. Frustration, cold and sharp, cut through Ethan's grief-numbed state. For the better part of an hour, Max had been a statue of obsessive focus, his entire being directed at the basement door. The low, persistent whine was beginning to grate on Ethan's nerves, a mournful sound in a house already too full of ghosts. He had tried commands, both soft and firm, but the dog was immovable. "Fine," Ethan finally snapped, the word echoing in the quiet entryway. "You want to see the basement? Let's go see the basement." He grabbed a heavy flashlight from a hook by the door, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hand. He turned the old brass knob and pulled. The door opened with a long, drawn-out squeal of protest from its hinges, releasing a wave of cool, musty air that smelled of damp earth, mildew, and the faint metallic tang of rust. The wooden stairs leading down were steep and narrow, just as he remembered. His father's warning about their rickety state had been an understatement. They groaned and shifted under his weight. He descended carefully, the flashlight beam cutting a bright circle through the oppressive darkness. Max followed so closely behind that his nose was practically touching Ethan's heel, his usual confidence replaced by a tense, purposeful energy. The basement was a cavern of forgotten things. The stone foundation walls wept with moisture, and the low ceiling was a web of thick cobwebs and exposed pipes. It was a graveyard for the tools and gear of his father's life as a fisherman. Piles of old nets, their cork floats like fossilized beads, lay tangled in a corner. A stack of lobster traps sat against one wall, their wooden slats warped and gray. It was exactly as he expected, a damp, disorganized space with nothing of value, nothing to see. He swept the flashlight beam around the room, the light glinting off a stray bottle, a pile of old chains. "See, boy?" he said, his voice flat. "Nothing. Just junk. Now let's go." But Max paid him no attention. The dog completely ignored the rest of the basement's sights and smells. He walked with a singular purpose to the far wall, a section of exposed planking between the stone supports. Stacked haphazardly against it was a collection of rusted seafaring equipment, a heavy iron gaffing hook, a dented buoy, and several coils of stiff, weathered rope. This was the source of Max's fixation. His restlessness, which had been a low hum upstairs, now peaked into a clear, sharp signal. He began to pace back and forth in the small, clear space in front of the wall, his tail held low and rigid. He pushed his nose into the cracks between the wooden planks, sniffing with an intensity that made his whole body tremble. Then, he let out a whine that was no longer just anxious, but pleading. It was a sound of profound urgency, a sound Ethan had only ever heard from him in the field when the dog had located something vital. "Max, come on!" "It's a rat's nest, that's all," Ethan said, trying to rationalize the dog's strange behavior. "You smell a mouse." Max looked back at him, his amber eyes wide, and let out a single, sharp bark. It was not an aggressive sound, but a clear, commanding report. "Here, pay attention, here." Then he turned back to the wall and, lifting a paw, began to scratch gently at the wood. Ethan sighed, a deep, weary breath. He was tired of the house, tired of the memories, and now tired of his dog's inexplicable obsession. For 15 years, he had trusted this animal's instincts with his life. Max had been trained to detect things unseen, to find the hidden and the dangerous. But this was a damp basement in Maine, not a dusty village in Afghanistan. Still, the habit of trust was a hard one to break, and frankly, the dog's persistence was becoming impossible to ignore. Maybe if he just proved there was nothing there, Max would finally settle down. All right, I get it," he muttered, setting the flashlight down on a wooden crate so it illuminated the space. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." He grabbed the heavy gaff hook and the buoy, moving them aside. They left dark, clean outlines on the dusty floor where they had sat for years. He then began to untangle the stiff coils of rope. As he worked, he could feel Max's intense gaze on him, feel the dog's hopeful, anxious energy filling the small space. With the area cleared, he faced the wall itself. It was made of thick, rough-hewn pine planks, darkened with age and moisture. There was nothing remarkable about it. It looked exactly like the other wooden sections of the basement. He ran a hand over the surface, feeling the rough grain and the heads of rusted nails. He was about to turn away, to tell Max that the game was over, but something made him hesitate. A lifetime of training, perhaps. An anomaly has been reported. Investigate. He balled his hand into a fist and knocked lightly on the center of the wall. The sound that came back was wrong. It wasn't the dense, solid thud of wood against a stone foundation. It was a shallow, resonant thump. It was hollow. Ethan froze. He knocked again, this time harder, moving his fist a few feet to the left. Thud. Solid. A few feet to the right. Thud. Solid. He returned to the center. Thump. Hollow. A distinct, unmistakable pocket of empty space, about the size of a door. A jolt, electric and strange, shot through him. Annoyance was instantly replaced by a sharp, burning curiosity. He crouched down, examining the planks with a new, critical eye. They looked identical to the rest, But now he could see what he had missed. The seams between these central planks were almost invisibly tight, the work of a careful hand. And there were no nail heads here. These boards were not fixed to the foundation. His heart began to beat faster. He stood and scanned the messy collection of his father's tools leaning against a nearby support beam. His eyes landed on a long, heavy-duty crowbar, its end worn and flattened from years of use. It felt heavy and powerful in his hands, a tool made for revealing things. He returned to the wall and wedged the flat end of the crowbar into a tiny seam. He put his weight into it. The old wood groaned in protest. With a sharp crack, the board splintered slightly, but held fast. He repositioned the crowbar, found a better point of leverage, and pushed again. This time, a nail screeched as it was pulled from its hidden anchor. The top of a plank popped loose, swinging outward an inch. Dust and the scent of dry, ancient wood filled the air. Max whined again, a sound of encouragement now. Ethan worked with a frantic energy, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He was no longer just a son cleaning out a house. He was an explorer on the verge of a discovery. He worked the crowbar down the seam, and with a final, wrenching pull, the entire section of planks came free, swinging inward into the darkness like a gate. He stood back, breathing heavily, his knuckles white on the handle of the crowbar. It was a door. A perfectly concealed, masterfully crafted secret door built into the very foundation of the house. He stared into the pitch-black opening, his mind racing, unable to process the reality of it. All those years, all those silent dinners and empty hallways, and this was here, hidden beneath their feet, a secret his father had taken to his grave. Max was now calm, sitting patiently by Ethan's side, his duty done. The trail had led them here, and now it was up to Ethan to walk it. For a long moment, Ethan did not move. He stood on the damp stone floor of the basement, the iron crowbar still heavy in his hand, and stared into the rectangle of absolute blackness he had just revealed. The air that drifted out from the opening was not the musty, wet air of the cellar. It was something else entirely. A dry, clean scent that carried a hint of sawdust and something warm and resinous. It was the ghost of a forest. Max, who had been the catalyst for this whole strange turn of events, was now perfectly calm. He sat at Ethan's side, his breathing even, and looked up at his master as if to say, "See, I told you something was here." Taking a steadying breath, Ethan leaned the crowbar against the wall. He picked up the flashlight and aimed its powerful beam into the opening. The light did not reveal another damp, stone-walled chamber. It illuminated a single, clean wooden step. He hesitated for only a second more. He had breached the outer defense of his father's secret. There was no turning back now. He stepped through the opening, crouching slightly to clear the low frame. He found himself in a short, narrow passage, walled with smooth-fitted pine. After 3 steps, the passage opened into a room, and Ethan stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The flashlight beam swept across a scene so completely alien to the house above and the cellar behind that for a moment he felt a dizzying sense of dislocation. He fumbled along the wall beside the entrance, his fingers finding a simple, old-fashioned toggle switch. He flipped it. A single bare light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling flickered to life, casting a warm, steady, golden glow over the room. And Ethan saw. He was standing in a world made of wood. It was a workshop, but it was unlike any workshop he had ever seen. The air was warm and dry, filled with the rich, clean aromas of pine, cedar, and the sharp, pleasant tang of linseed oil. It was the scent of creation. There was no clutter, no chaos. The space was a testament to a mind that craved order and precision. It was a sanctuary of discipline. Along one entire wall, a massive pegboard held a breathtaking array of hand tools. Each saw, hammer, and file hung in its perfect place. A clean white outline painted behind it, a shadow waiting for its tool to come home. A long, custom-built rack held dozens of wood chisels and gouges, their polished steel edges gleaming, their wooden handles arranged in a perfect gradient from largest to smallest. He saw hand planes made of dark, heavy wood and gleaming brass, looking more like sculptures than tools. It was the arsenal of a master craftsman, and it was cared for with the same meticulous devotion that Ethan applied to his own rifle. A massive, heavy-topped workbench stood in the center of the room. Its surface, made of thick maple, was a landscape of honorable scars, nicks, cuts, and the dark stains of oil and varnish. Yet it was completely clear, wiped clean, ready for the next project. At one end stood a heavy cast-iron vise. At the other, a row of small, labeled drawers for screws and fittings. Everything had a place. Everything was in its place. This quiet, fanatical organization struck a chord deep within Ethan. It was a language he understood. The silent man upstairs, the man of grunts and gestures, had possessed a soul that demanded the same rigorous order that had been drilled into Ethan in the military. His gaze moved from the tools to the projects themselves. Pinned to a large corkboard on the opposite wall were not crude sketches, but complex, detailed design blueprints drawn with the precise hand of an architect. He saw plans for a beautiful rocking chair with elegantly curved legs, a design for a small boat with clean, swift lines, and a series of drawings for a child's rocking horse, complete with detailed notes on the joinery for the legs and the carving of the mane. The handwriting was his father's. A tight, controlled script so different from the scrawl on the grocery lists he used to leave on the kitchen counter. But it was the objects on a long shelf above the blueprints that truly stunned him into silence. Here were the fruits of all this hidden labor, a collection of works in various stages of completion. There was a small, delicate bird, carved from a single piece of light-colored wood, its wings half unfurled as if about to take flight. The detail on the feathers was so fine he could not imagine the steady hand required to create it. Beside it was a set of wooden animal toys, a bear, a wolf, a deer, sanded to a perfect silken smoothness, waiting for a coat of paint. He picked up the small wooden wolf, its form simple but perfect, and turned it over and over in his hand. It felt warm, alive. His eyes fell upon a beautiful wooden box, its sides joined with intricate dovetail joints, a technique he knew required immense skill and patience. The lid was only half finished, a complex geometric pattern inlaid with a darker wood. Ethan felt overwhelmed, as if he had stumbled into a stranger's home, a stranger's life. The man who made these things, the man who dreamed these designs and possessed this incredible, patient skill, was not the man he knew. His father, Samuel Vance, was a fisherman, a gruff, weathered man whose hands were calloused from hauling nets and gutting fish. He was a man who smelled of the sea, who fixed engines with brute force, who communicated in silence. This man, the secret man of this hidden room, was an artist. He was a creator of delicate, beautiful things. He possessed a sensitivity, a passion, a deep-seated need to create beauty that he had successfully hidden from his only son for 35 years. Ethan walked slowly around the room, touching nothing more, just looking. He was a soldier trained in reconnaissance, and this was the most important survey of his life. He was mapping the terrain of his father's soul. He finally understood. This room was not a hobby. A hobby is something you share, something you talk about. This was something else entirely. This was a secret. This was a refuge. It was the place Samuel Vance came to be himself, to shed the skin of the stoic provider and become the man he was truly meant to be. The silence upstairs, in the main house, had not been a sign of emptiness. It had been a wall, built to protect this sacred space. He looked at the single, warm light bulb, at the silent tools, at the beautiful, unfinished creations. This was not just a workshop. This was a sanctuary. And he, the son who thought he knew his father's silence so well, had never even known it existed. Time seemed to dissolve in the warm golden light of the workshop. Ethan stood motionless, a soldier on foreign soil, trying to reconcile his map of the world with the strange, beautiful, and impossible landscape before him. The man he knew, the father he had spent 15 years running from, had not existed. Or rather, he had only been a fraction of the truth, a heavily guarded perimeter around this secret, vibrant core. His eyes were eventually drawn to the workbench, the heart of this hidden sanctuary. It was the only object in the room that bore the marks of both chaos and control. While the rest of the workshop was a monument to order, the bench was a history of passion, its surface a testament to thousands of hours of focused creative labor. And sitting directly in the center of the otherwise cleared bench, placed with a kind of quiet intention, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound book. It was not new. The dark brown leather was worn smooth and soft at the corners, cracked and creased along the spine. It had the look and feel of an object that had been handled daily, a constant companion. There was no title on the cover. It was as plain and unadorned as the man who had owned it. Ethan reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers tracing the worn cover. This felt different from looking at the tools or the unfinished carvings. This felt like a more profound intrusion. To open this book would be to cross a final line, to read the thoughts of a man who never spoke them aloud. For a moment, he considered leaving it, closing the secret door, and walking away. It would be easier to sell the house and leave with his simple, painful memories intact than to face the complex truth this book might contain. Max, who had been sitting quietly at the foot of the workbench, seemed to sense his master's hesitation. The dog got to his feet, walked over, and pushed his cool, wet nose into Ethan's hand. It was a simple, grounding gesture, a silent nudge of encouragement. Ethan looked down into the dog's steady amber eyes, took a deep breath, and picked up the book. He sat on the sturdy wooden stool by the bench and opened it. The first thing he noticed was the handwriting. It was the same tight, controlled script from the blueprints, but here, on the lined pages of the book, it seemed more personal. The title page was blank. He turned to the first entry. It was dated May 4th, 1999. Began sketches for the kitchen cabinets. Pine is too soft, prone to denting. Oak is better. More expensive, but it will last. Mary always wanted oak cabinets. Ethan frowned. This wasn't a diary. It was a logbook, a record of work. He flipped through the pages. Most of the entries were just like that. Technical, precise, and focused on the craft. June 12, 1999. First dovetail joints for the drawers. Cut them by hand. Saw is sharp, but my hand is not as steady as it used to be. Patience. The wood teaches you patience. August 21st, 2002. Repaired the leg on Mrs. Gable's antique chair. Cherry wood. Beautiful grain. It feels good to fix something broken. It was a meticulous account of his father's secret life, a catalog of projects, techniques, and observations about the nature of wood. But as Ethan read on, he began to notice something else. Tucked in between the notes on wood grain and joinery, there were other, shorter entries. They were different, more personal. They were written as if Samuel were speaking to someone. September 30th, 2005. A storm is coming in from the north. The wind sounds like it's trying to tell a story. Wish you were here to listen to it with me, Mary. Ethan's breath hitched. Mary, his mother. His father was writing to her. He began to read more carefully, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The logbook was a one-sided conversation, a collection of letters to a ghost. March 5th, 2007. The boy is 13 today. He's getting tall, has your eyes. He asked about the boat engine. I tried to show him, but he got frustrated. I do not have the right words, Mary. I never have. Ethan had to stop. He remembered that day. He remembered the feeling of being clumsy, of his father's impatient gestures. He had thought it was anger, but here, in his father's own hand, was the truth. It was not anger, but a crippling inability to communicate. He kept reading, his world slowly tilting on its axis with every page he turned. December 25th, 2010. First Christmas since he left for the army. The house is too quiet. I hope they are teaching him to be a good man. I hope he is safe. I turned on the lights on the porch, just in case he came home. He did not. Ethan closed his eyes, the memory of that first lonely Christmas on a military base, flooding back. He had felt a grim satisfaction in his isolation then, a feeling of righteous separation. He had never once considered that back in Maine, a light had been left on for him. The entries continued, a heartbreaking mix of the mundane and the profound. Technical notes on a project would be followed by a raw, lonely observation. February 11th, 2017. Finished sanding the little wooden bear. The grain is smooth as river stone. Maybe I will send it to him. But he is a soldier now. He has no use for toys. January 15th, 2018. Big win today. Reminds me of the night you left us. Miss you. The boy didn't call again. Hope he's okay out there. The clumsy, simple words were like hammer blows to the wall Ethan had built around his heart. The stern, silent man of his memory began to dissolve, replaced by this new, fragile image. A man drowning in a sea of unspoken grief and worry. A lonely craftsman who spoke to his dead wife in the pages of a logbook and poured all of his unexpressed love for his son into carvings the boy would never see. He was not a cold man. He was a heartbroken man who did not know how to show his love in any way other than to build, to fix, to create. His silence had not been a weapon of disapproval. It had been a shield, protecting a heart that was far more sensitive and vulnerable than Ethan had ever imagined. He slowly closed the book, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. The air in the workshop was thick with the presence of his father, not as a ghost, but as a man he was only just beginning to meet. The simple, painful narrative that had defined his life for 15 years, the story of a disappointed father and a son who ran away, was a lie. Or at least, it was not the whole truth. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that he had to read on. He had to know the rest of the story. The craftsman's logbook felt heavy in Ethan's lap, a weight of unspoken words and hidden truths. The scattered entries he had read so far had chipped away at the edges of the cold, hard caricature of his father he had carried for 15 years. Now, he needed to find the heart of it all. He needed to find the wound that had festered into the silence that defined his life. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he began to flip through the pages. He was no longer reading at random. He was searching. The entries in the logbook were meticulously dated, a timeline of his father's hidden life. Ethan moved past years of notes, his eyes scanning the dates in the corners of the pages. 2003, 2004, 2005. He was getting closer. He slowed as he reached the summer of 2006. He was 16 years old then, full of a restless, reckless energy. The entries from that summer were much the same as the others. June 1st, 2006. Good haul of haddock today. The Sea Star's engine is running a little rough. Need to replace the fuel filter. Mary, you always hated the smell of diesel. I find a strange comfort in it. July 20th, 2006. Started the plans for the rocking horse. The boy is too old for it now, of course, but maybe for his children one day. A man should leave something behind that will last. Ethan read the entry with a pang of guilt. He had been so wrapped up in his own teenage world that summer. He had no idea his father was in this hidden room, dreaming of a future for a family that Ethan felt so disconnected from. He kept turning the pages, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He was approaching the date, August 14th, 2006, the day of the accident. He found the entry for August 13th, a simple note about a loose board on the porch. He held his breath and turned the page. The pages for August 14th and August 15th were blank. Completely, starkly, terrifyingly blank. There was no angry tirade, no scrawled words of disappointment or fury, no mention of the sheriff or the wrecked car, or his son's foolish, life-altering mistake. There was only silence. A silence so absolute that it had consumed the pages of the book itself. It was the same crushing silence he remembered from the car ride home, now immortalized in empty paper and ink. For Ethan, that void was more damning than any curse his father could have written. With a sense of dread, he forced himself to turn the page again. There, dated a week later, August 22nd, 2006, was a short, stark entry. The handwriting was tight, as if carved into the page. Sold the Sea Star. Have to take care of the boy first. The words did not compute. Ethan read them again, and a third time. Sold the Sea Star. It had to be a mistake, a different boat, a figure of speech. He remembered the Sea Star. Of course his father still had it. It was his life. Tucked into a thin leather flap on the inside back cover of the logbook, Ethan's fingers found a sheaf of folded papers. He pulled them out. They were old, the creases worn soft, the paper yellowed with age. He unfolded the first one. It was a bill of sale dated August 21st, 2006. In consideration of the sum of $12,000, Samuel Vance hereby sells and transfers ownership of the fishing vessel Sea Star to one Thomas Finney. At the bottom was his father's signature, tight and precise. A wave of dizziness washed over Ethan. He fumbled with the other papers. There was a loan agreement from the Down East Credit Union for $5,000, using the house as collateral. And finally, a series of carbon copy receipts. One after another, they documented payments made to the Miller family, the people whose car he had hit. The final receipt, marked paid in full, was for $17,000. The exact sum of the boat sale and the bank loan. He stared at the papers, the numbers, his father's signature, and the entire foundation of his world crumbled. The Sea Star. It hadn't just been a boat. It had been his father's kingdom. Ethan's mind flew back in time, and he was a little boy again, standing on the deck of that boat, the sea spray cool on his face. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes, a rare and brilliant thing, as he stood at the helm, his hands sure and steady on the wheel. The Sea Star was his father's freedom, his livelihood, the one place where the silent man became a confident, capable captain. It was the only thing Samuel Vance had ever truly loved, besides his wife. And he had sold it. He had sold his kingdom, his freedom, his very soul, to pay for his son's mistake. And he had never, not once, said a word. The silence. It all came crashing down on Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The silence had not been condemnation. It had not been disappointment. It had been the sound of a man quietly, stoically, sacrificing everything. It was the silence of a man walking to the bank, head held high, to sign a loan that must have felt like a failure. It was the silence of handing over the keys to his boat, his life, to another man. It was the silence of a man shouldering a burden so heavy it left no room for words. He hadn't been shaming his son, he had been protecting him. Protecting him from the truth of what his mistake had cost. A sound tore from Ethan's throat, a raw, guttural sob that was ripped from the deepest part of his soul. The papers fluttered from his numb fingers, scattering on the floor of the workshop like dead leaves. He doubled over, his head in his hands, the disciplined control of the soldier shattering into a million pieces. The grief he had not felt upon hearing of his father's death now consumed him, a tidal wave of sorrow, regret, and a guilt so profound it felt like it was physically crushing him. He had spent 15 years of his life believing he was a disappointment to his father. The truth was so much worse. He had not been a disappointment. He had been a burden. A secret $17,000 burden that had cost his father everything. And he, in his arrogant, youthful pride, had mistaken the weight of that sacrifice for the coldness of a man who did not care. Max, who had been lying quietly, instantly rose and came to him. The dog pushed his great head under Ethan's arm, whining softly, pressing his solid, warm body against him as the sobs racked his frame. Ethan wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick gray fur, and for the first time since he was a small boy who had lost his mother, he wept. He wept for the man he had never known, and for the son who had been too blind to see. The sobs eventually subsided, leaving Ethan raw and trembling, like a battlefield after the last gun has fallen silent. Max remained steadfast beside him, a warm anchor in a suddenly tumultuous world. Ethan slowly disentangled himself from the dog's embrace, his movements stiff, as if his muscles had forgotten how to function. He sat up, his eyes swollen and stinging, his face a roadmap of grief and profound shock. The workshop, which moments ago had felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to mock him with its quiet order. Every perfectly hung tool, every pristine surface, every beautifully carved piece of wood was a silent testament to a man Ethan had utterly failed to understand. The scattered papers of the Sea Star lay accusingly on the floor, the tangible evidence of his father's sacrifice, a constant, sharp pain in his peripheral vision. He had to get up. He had to move. He couldn't stay there, drowning in regret. Max nudged his hand with his nose, a soft, encouraging gesture. Ethan looked at the dog, then at the workbench, then at the shelves laden with his father's hidden art. He was here now. He could not run again. He slowly rose, his legs feeling like lead. He meticulously gathered the papers from the floor, smoothing the creases, and tucked them back into the logbook. He could not bring himself to read further. Not yet. He needed a moment to breathe, to simply exist in this new, disorienting truth. His gaze swept across the workshop, searching for a distraction, anything to pull his mind away from the fresh, gaping wound in his heart. His eyes landed on a covered object tucked away in a dimly lit corner, partially obscured by a stack of lumber and a forgotten paint can. It was draped with a heavy canvas tarp, protecting it from dust. He walked towards it, Max trailing quietly behind him. He reached out and pulled the tarp away. Beneath the canvas, sitting on a sturdy wooden base, was a baby's crib. It was made of dark, rich walnut, its wood grain rippling like quiet water. Every slat was perfectly turned, every joint seamless. The headboard and footboard were masterpieces of intricate carving. Tiny, delicate whales swam through a sea of swirling waves, their forms so lifelike they seemed to glide on the wood. It was a piece of craftsmanship so exquisite it took Ethan's breath away. But it was unfinished. One of the corner posts, meant to be crowned with a carved lighthouse, was only half done. The light itself was roughly shaped, waiting for the fine details, the windows, the tiny railing around its base. And the intricate carving of the waves on the footboard faded into rough, unworked wood towards one end, as if the craftsman had simply stopped, leaving his masterpiece incomplete. Ethan reached out a trembling hand and traced the rough, unworked edges. He noticed that the final, delicate cuts on the already completed carvings, particularly the tiny, precise lines defining the whale's flukes and the crests of the waves, seemed less sure, less steady than the rest. A few tiny, almost invisible nicks marred the otherwise perfect surface, as if the hand holding the chisel had faltered at the very end. He ran his fingers over the beautiful, yet tragically incomplete work of art. The crib was a testament to patience, skill, and an overflowing, boundless love. It was a legacy. And then he saw it. Tucked into a small carved compartment on the inside of the unfinished corner post, barely visible, was a small folded piece of paper. His father's handwriting, tight and controlled. "For my son, when he comes home." Ethan crumpled, his knees giving way beneath him. He sank to the floor, leaning against the unfinished crib, his head resting against the smooth, cool walnut. He didn't sob this time. He just made a low, guttural sound, an animal sound of pure, unadulterated pain. The crib. His father had made a crib for his grandchild. The grandchild he would never meet. The bitter irony was a fresh twist of the knife in his gut. Ethan had been married, briefly, after his first tour of duty. It had been a whirlwind romance, born of the intensity of post-deployment euphoria. His wife, Sarah, had been a kind, gentle soul. They had talked about starting a family, about building a life. But the scars of war, combined with the deeper, older wounds of his past, had made him a difficult man to live with. He had pushed her away, unconsciously recreating the emotional distance he had experienced with his own father. Their divorce had been finalized in 2022, quietly, without ceremony. He had never told his father about Sarah, never told him about the brief hope of a family. He had been too proud, too ashamed of another failure. He had believed Samuel wouldn't care, and now, here was the proof, crafted in walnut and quiet devotion, that his father had cared more than he could ever have imagined. He had been building a future for Ethan, a cradle for a grandchild, long before Ethan himself had even truly considered it. And the unfinished details, the slight tremble in the final carvings, the half-formed lighthouse, it clicked into place, a devastating realization. It wasn't that his father had stopped because Ethan's marriage failed. It was something else. Something in the logbook, in the entries about his weakening hand, about the struggle for a steady cut. His father's body had betrayed him. He had run out of time. His hands, once strong and sure, had begun to fail him, preventing him from completing this final, most personal masterpiece. Ethan reached out and laid his hand on the smooth, cool wood of the crib, tracing the delicate carving of a whale. It was a tangible expression of a love that had flowed beneath the surface of his life like a hidden river, unseen, unfelt, and tragically unacknowledged. The silence of his father was not a void, but a profound well, brimming with unexpressed emotion, poured into the very fibers of this wood. He closed his eyes, his forehead pressed against the cool wood. His father's love had always been there, patient, persistent, waiting for him to come home, not just to the house, but to the truth. And he, the son, had been too lost in his own pain, too blinded by his own assumptions to see it. The regret was a living, breathing thing inside him, tearing at his soul. Max, sensing the depth of his master's sorrow, rested his head on Ethan's shoulder, a silent, comforting presence in the quiet workshop. It was the only solace he had. Ethan did not know how long he sat on the floor of the workshop, the cold of the concrete seeping into his bones. The profound shock had given way to a vast, empty ache, a hollowness that felt larger than grief itself. Max stayed close, a silent, furry sentinel, his presence the only thing that felt real in a world that had been turned completely upside down. The truth he had uncovered was too immense, too devastating to process alone in the silent, weighted atmosphere of the house. The scattered papers, the unfinished crib, the logbook, it was all evidence, but it was the evidence of a secret life, a one-sided story. He needed to hear a voice. He needed a witness, someone who had known his father not just as the silent man in the house, but as the man who had existed in the world outside. There was only one person he could think of. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice raspy. He pushed himself to his feet, his body stiff and sore. "Let's go for a ride." He left the workshop, pulling the concealed door shut behind him, the quiet click echoing in the basement. He did not bother to replace the planks that had hidden it. The secret was out. He ascended the creaking stairs, walked through the silent house, and stepped out into the crisp, cold air of the late afternoon. The short drive into the coastal town of Port Clyde was a blur. The familiar landscape of pine trees and granite outcroppings, which had seemed so oppressive upon his arrival, now looked different. It looked like his father's world, a place of quiet, rugged beauty that he had never truly taken the time to see. He parked the truck in front of a weathered storefront with faded blue lettering that read, "Holloway's Hardware and Marine Supply." He remembered the smell of the place from his childhood, a unique mix of sawdust, metal, and bait. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival, and stepped inside. The store was a cluttered but organized haven of practical things. Shelves were laden with everything from fishing lures and rope to plumbing fixtures and paint cans. Behind a long wooden counter stood the man who had called him, Mr. Ben Holloway. He was a man in his late 60s, with a full head of white hair and a face deeply lined from years of squinting into the sun and sharing laughs with his customers. He had kind, pale blue eyes that held a hint of a mariner's weariness. He was wiping down the counter with a cloth, but he stopped the moment he saw Ethan. "Ethan," he said, his voice gentle. He put the cloth down. "I was wondering when you might stop by." Ethan walked slowly to the counter, Max at his heel. He didn't know where to begin. The questions in his mind were a chaotic jumble. "Mr. Holloway," he started, his voice still rough. I needed to ask you about something. About my father." Ben nodded slowly, his kind eyes studying Ethan's face. He saw the swollen eyes, the profound exhaustion. "Of course, son, whatever you need to ask." "The Sea Star," Ethan said, the name of the boat feeling like a stone in his mouth. "His boat, I thought. I always assumed he still had it." A shadow passed over Ben's face. He leaned against the counter and sighed, a sound heavy with old memories. "Ah, the Sea Star. That was a fine boat. Your father loved that vessel like it was a member of the family." "No, son, he sold it, a long time ago. Back in 2006 it was." "Why?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. He just needed to hear it from someone else. Ben was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "He made me promise, Ethan. He made me swear I would never tell you. He came in here the day after he sold it, looking like he'd lost a limb. I asked him what was wrong, and he just shook his head. He said, "It's done. The boy is safe." He told me it was a father's job to carry the weight, not the son's, and he never spoke of it again. The words landed like soft, steady blows, each one confirming the devastating truth. It wasn't a secret kept out of anger, but out of a fierce, protective love. "He was proud of you, you know," Ben continued, his voice softer now. "So incredibly proud. After you enlisted, every time you sent a letter, he'd bring it in here. His eyes weren't what they used to be, so he'd have me read it to him. He'd just stand there, listening, with this look on his face, a kind of quiet, fierce pride. He kept a picture of you in your uniform in his wallet, showed it to any salesman or tourist who'd stand still long enough to look." Ethan felt a fresh wave of grief wash over him. But this time, it was different. It was a sorrow mixed with a strange, painful warmth. His father had been proud of him. The man he had run from, the man he thought despised him, had been carrying his picture in his wallet. "I found something," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "In the basement. A workshop and a crib." It was unfinished. Ben's sad smile returned. His church, he called it. That was his real home. And that crib, oh, that crib, it was his greatest joy and his greatest sorrow. He was so excited when he started it. He'd come in here, showing me the sketches, talking about the walnut he'd ordered special. He said he wanted his grandchild to have something made of love and patience. Then's gaze drifted to a calendar on the wall, as if looking into the past. But his hands, the last couple of years, the arthritis got bad. He'd come in here some days, so frustrated he could barely speak. He'd hold up his hands and just shake his head. He said they wouldn't listen to him anymore. He couldn't make the fine cuts. Not being able to finish that gift for you, for the grandchild he hoped you'd have. I think that broke his heart more than selling the boat ever did. And there it was, the final missing piece of the puzzle. The full, tragic, beautiful portrait of the man his father was. A man who sacrificed his past, dreamed of a future, and was tormented by a present that betrayed him. A man who loved his son so much that he bore the weight of his silence and his secrets alone until the very end. Ethan could only nod, unable to speak. He had come here for answers, and Ben had given them to him. The fisherman's memory had filled in the gaps of the craftsman's logbook. "He was a good man, Ethan," Ben said again, his voice thick with emotion. He reached over the counter and placed a gnarled, gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. Just a man who didn't know how to say the words. So he said them with his hands instead. Ethan finally met the old man's gaze, and for the first time, he let the full, unvarnished truth of his father's love settle into his heart. The drive back from Port Clyde was a journey through a world remade. Ethan drove slowly, the familiar coastal road now looking entirely new to him. The stoic, resilient pine trees clinging to the granite cliffs, the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic, they no longer seemed lonely or bleak. They looked like his father, quiet, strong, and enduring. When he finally pulled the truck onto the gravel lane, the house on the bluff did not look like a monument to his failures. It looked like a home, waiting for its son to finally, truly return. He left the truck running and walked through the front door, Max padding silently at his side. He didn't pause in the living room or the kitchen. He walked with a newfound purpose, a steady, measured pace that was different from the soldier's march he had used before. It was the walk of a man who knew where he was going. He descended the creaking stairs to the basement and stepped through the opening into the workshop. The warm golden light and the rich smell of wood and oil welcomed him. This time there was no shock, no confusion. There was only a profound sense of coming home. The space was no longer a secret he had discovered, but a truth he now shared. He looked at the perfectly ordered tools, the meticulously drawn blueprints, the half-finished works of art. This was not just his father's sanctuary. It was his father's heart, laid bare. His original mission, Operation Clean Sweep, seemed like a bad joke now. The cold, detached plan of a boy who had understood nothing. To sell this house, to auction off these tools, to let this sacred space be emptied and filled with the meaningless belongings of strangers, it would be the final, unforgivable betrayal. It would be to take his father's sacrifice, his silent love, and discard it like junk. Max, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, leaned his solid weight against Ethan's leg, looking up with his intelligent amber eyes. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. The familiar feel of the thick fur a comforting anchor. He looked at Max, then at the unfinished crib in the corner, and he knew. The past was not a battlefield to be escaped or a ruin to be abandoned. It was a foundation to be built upon. It was a wound to be healed. "I'm staying, boy," he whispered, the words feeling more right than anything he had said in years. "We're staying." A powerful, quiet determination settled over him, displacing the chaotic grief that had consumed him. He had a new mission now, one that was not assigned to him, but one that rose from the deepest part of his soul. It was a mission of remembrance, of reconciliation, and of redemption. He walked over to the corkboard and carefully, reverently, took down the blueprints for the crib. He spread them out on the clean surface of the workbench. He studied them for a long time, tracing the elegant lines with his finger. He saw his father's mind at work. The precise measurements, the notes in the margins about the grain of the wood, the careful calculations for the joints. It was a language of love, expressed in numbers and angles. This was how his father had spoken to him, to the future. Then he turned to the wall of tools. He stood before the pegboard, his eyes scanning the rows of gleaming steel and polished wood. He was not just choosing tools, he was choosing his inheritance. He reached out and took down a medium-sized gouge, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark from his father's grip. He could almost feel the phantom warmth of his father's hand in the wood. He selected a small, fine-toothed dovetail saw and a wooden mallet. He held them in his hands. They did not feel like foreign objects. They felt like a promise. He walked to the corner where the unfinished crib stood, a silent, beautiful testament to a love interrupted. He ran his hand over the half-carved lighthouse, the rough, unfinished wood, a stark contrast to the silken smoothness of the completed sections. He could see where his father's hand had begun to falter, where the lines had lost their confidence. He took a deep breath, the scent of walnut filling his lungs. He placed the sharp edge of the chisel against the rough wood of the lighthouse. He raised the mallet. The silence in the workshop was absolute, a held breath. And as he began to work, as the mallet met the handle of the chisel with a soft, solid thunk, he began to speak to his father in the only way that mattered now. "I'm sorry," he thought. His entire being focused on the tiny curl of wood that peeled away under the blade. "I'm sorry I was so blind. I'm sorry I wasn't here." Another tap of the mallet, another perfect curl of wood. He was not hacking at the piece, but gently, carefully, following the lines his father had drawn, continuing the work that had been started. "Thank you," his soul whispered to the silent room, "for the sea star, for protecting me, for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on you." He worked for hours, the world outside the workshop dissolving away. There was only the warm light, the scent of the wood, the tool in his hand, and the quiet, steady rhythm of his work. Max, his duty done, curled up on a pile of clean burlap sacks in the corner, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, the soft sound of his breathing a gentle accompaniment to the whisper of the chisel. Ethan was no longer a soldier. He was no longer a runaway. He was a son, picking up the tools his father had laid down. With every careful cut, he was finishing more than just a piece of furniture. He was finishing a conversation that had been left silent for 19 years. He was carving his apology, his gratitude, and his love into the very wood that his father had chosen for him. The silence of the workshop was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of healing. The long, harsh Maine winter had been a crucible of ice and silence. Snow had buried the gravel lane, and the salt spray had frozen in crystalline patterns on the windows. But inside the old wooden house on the bluff, a quiet, steady warmth had taken root. And deep in the earth, in the hidden workshop, a son had spent the cold, dark months getting to know his father. Now, spring was arriving. It came not in a sudden burst, but tentatively, in small, courageous signs. The thick blanket of snow began to recede, revealing the tough, resilient grass beneath. The ice in the cove cracked and groaned, breaking apart to reveal the dark, restless water of the Atlantic. The days grew longer, and the sunlight that slanted through the workshop's small, high window carried a new, gentle warmth. The seasons had changed, and so had Ethan. The gaunt, haunted look of the soldier had softened. The rigid, controlled posture had relaxed into the easy stance of a craftsman. He had spent the winter not just clearing out the house, but claiming it, mending it. He had fixed the loose board on the porch, reglazed a cracked window, and cleared the chimney. And in the workshop, he had worked. He had learned the language of his father's tools, the unique character of each type of wood. The work was slow, painstaking, and deeply meditative. Every curl of wood that fell from his chisel felt like a layer of old resentment being peeled away. Every perfectly fitted joint felt like a broken piece of his own past being mended. He was not just building, he was healing. The crib had become his entire world. It was no longer just his father's unfinished project. It had become a collaboration across time, a conversation between two generations. He followed his father's intricate designs, his own hands moving to complete the work his fathers had been forced to abandon. And now, on a cool, clear morning in early April, it was time for the final touch. He stood before the crib, a masterpiece of dark, rippling walnut. The tiny carved whales seemed to swim in the wood grain, and the waves crested with a lifelike energy. All that remained was the small lighthouse on the corner post, the piece his father's failing hands had left as a rough, unformed block. He picked up the finest of his father's carving knives. The handle was worn smooth, perfectly contoured to a hand that was not his, but felt familiar all the same. He took a deep, steadying breath, the air rich with the scent of walnut and oil. His own hands were steady now, confident. Over the winter, he had discovered a patience he never knew he possessed, a quiet focus that was deeper and more lasting than the adrenaline-fueled concentration of the battlefield. He began to carve the final details. With the tip of the knife, he etched the tiny windows around the top of the lighthouse. He carved the delicate railing of the widow's walk, his movements precise and economical. He was no longer just a son finishing a gift. He was an artist, honoring the master who had come before him. As he worked, he felt his father's presence not as a ghost, but as a quiet, approving warmth in the still air of the workshop. He worked until the last tiny detail was perfect. Then he stepped back. It was done. The crib was a perfect whole, a seamless collaboration of two men's hands. The small lighthouse stood proudly on its corner, a beacon of hope and resilience. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was a story, a symbol of a love that had endured silence, sacrifice, and even death. It was a masterpiece of reconciliation. He was no longer the runaway soldier, a man defined by what he had fled. He was a son who had found his roots deep in the sawdust-covered floor of his father's workshop. He had come home looking for a fight, for a way to conquer the ghosts of his past. Instead, he had found peace. Not the fleeting, hollow peace between deployments, but a deep, quiet peace that settled in the soul. That evening, he carefully carried the finished crib up the stairs from the basement. It was heavier than he expected, weighted with history and love. He moved through the house, his house now, and placed the crib in the living room, beside the large window that overlooked the sea. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his father's old armchair, with Max's great head resting on his lap, and waited. Just before dawn, the sky began to change. The deep inky blackness softened to a bruised purple, then to a soft pearly gray. A thin line of brilliant orange appeared on the horizon, widening, spreading, and setting the undersides of the clouds on fire. The first rays of the spring sun broke over the edge of the world, and the calm gray water of the Atlantic was transformed into a glittering expanse of gold and silver. The sunlight streamed through the clean window and fell upon the finished crib, making the dark walnut glow with a warm inner light. The tiny, carved lighthouse seemed to catch the first light of day, a silent, steady beacon in the quiet room. Ethan looked at the crib, then out at the endless ocean, and a profound sense of calm settled over him. The future was an unknown territory, a map yet to be drawn. He did not know if he would become a craftsman like his father, or if he would one day have a child to lay in this beautiful cradle. But he knew, with a certainty that was as steady as the sunrise, that he would not be running anymore. He had come home to bury a father he thought he knew, and in doing so, had discovered a man he would spend the rest of his life loving. His father's legacy was not the weight of the past, not the burden of an unspoken sacrifice. It was this crib. It was this house. It was the quiet strength he now felt in his own two hands. It was a guiding light, a lighthouse on the coast of his own heart, showing him the way forward, illuminating the path home. And he was finally, truly, ready for the new day to begin. Sometimes the greatest love is not found in the words we hear, but in the quiet language of sacrifice, a language that can take a lifetime to understand. The unwavering loyalty of a dog like Max often serves as the key, unlocking the doors to the past and showing us the love that was always there. If you have a story of a silent love or a loyal companion who guided you, we would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. To join our community and help these stories reach others, we hope you will subscribe and share this journey. The next tale is already waiting for you. Just click the video on the screen to continue the adventure with us.